All right, and we're ready to get started.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today at our CITL webinar. I am Tara Corshane. I am a principal investigator at CITL and the Chief Research and Development Officer at CAST. And I'm very excited to introduce three panelists who are joining us today. And they are going to talk about how to select technology and design instruction, the knowledge, skills, and abilities that generalize across tools and settings. And we have a subtitle for that, which is Perspectives from Higher Education Experts in Orientation and Mobility. I'm going to take just a second to introduce them, and then we will kick off with our first question. So our three presenters or our three panelists today are Robert Wall Emerson, Sarah Elizabeth Bond, and Nicholas Guidis. Oh, Nicholas, I should have asked you how to say that first. Let's see here. Robert is a professor in the Department of Blindness and Low Vision Studies at Western Michigan University. He is a COMS and a TVI and has conducted blindness-related research for over 25 years. He has published over 85 peer-reviewed articles and 9 book chapters. He's an editor for the 4th edition of the Foundations of O&M and a research editor of the Journal of Visual Impairment and Blindness since 2012. And then Sarah Elizabeth has worked itinerantly and is in a residential school as a COMS, CATIS, C-A-T-I-S, and TVI. Dr. Bond teaches at Western Michigan University also in topics such as electronic travel aids, blindfold training, Braille, and assistive technology. She serves on the board of directors for Michigan Blind Athletic Association, the subject matter expert committee for assistive technology with ACVREP, as well as the advisory council for audio description. She has published in JVIB on techniques for teaching echo identification in O&M and assessment validation. And then our third panelist we have joining us today, Nicholas, is a professor of spatial computing in the School of Computing and Information Science at the University of Maine, where he is the founder and chief research scientist of the VEMI lab. He is also co-founder and chief research officer of UNAR Labs, a Maine-based startup company developing bio-inspired multisensory technologies supporting inclusive information access. His research deals with spatial cognition and information access for blind and visually impaired people, older adults, and sighted individuals in the eyes-free situations. He focuses on the design and evaluation of accessible multimodal technology supporting graphical access, mapping, and navigation. He has published over 100 scientific papers in these areas and is on the editorial board of 2 accessibility journals, the board of directors of 2 blindness-related organizations, and the scientific advisory board of 2 information access companies. He lives with his guide dog, Norbert, and in Portland and Bangor, Maine. So welcome to the 3 of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I am going to kick us off here with my first question. And Nicholas, I'm going to pass this question to you to start, and then Robert and Sarah Elizabeth, please feel free to jump in after he answers. So the first question I had is, how do you select the technologies to emphasize when you're teaching in higher ed or working in higher ed?
Thank you for inviting me to talk. And yeah, so I haven't prepped on these questions, so sorry if I'm a little bit disjointed, but yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's one that I think there isn't one answer. One of the ways that I select technologies is first what I've used. I'm myself congenitally blind, so if I find that a technology that I'm researching is something that I think stinks, then I don't want to use it. And I think a lot of times one of the things that happens with development of assistive technologies is that people aren't actual users, or you get engineers. I call it the engineering trap, where people will develop stuff because they might have some interesting idea, they think there's a cool algorithm, but they don't actually know much of the user needs. Such as this panel here. Obviously, we're interested in that. But one of the other things that I really try to emphasize are 2 things. I like technologies that are perceptual. And what I mean by that is most of the technologies that I deal with are interested in some way with space. So learning about space, whether it's through graphics or navigation or maps. And when you have a perceptual interface, it means that you can experience that information directly. So instead, you might see it, you might feel it, you might get audio descriptions or spatialized audio where you hear something coming from a specific place. Those types of interfaces are generally easier, faster, and less error prone than just the kind of default use of natural language, which is, most people just use language and they say, oh, it's non-visual. If you can't see, we'll use a linguistic description. And those work well for a lot of things. But I think in the spatial context, perceptual interfaces are good, and using commercial devices. So as much as possible, there's some things that you can't do commercially if you want to have a refreshable braille display or certain types of things. But there's a lot of things and a lot of technology that can harness commercial computational platforms and commercial sensors and the like, and it just makes it cheaper and makes it easier for people to get their hands on, because I could develop something that's really cool, but if it costs $50,000, it's not going to get in the hands of people that actually can use it. And, that's maybe fun if people come to my lab, but what happens to all the people that are out there in the real world? So focusing on as much as possible commercial devices, I think, is important.
And this is Rob. I take a slightly different tack in answering the question. If I'm looking at choosing technology to include in a university training program that's training O&M instructors, I want them to be exposed to the vast array of possible technology out there, good and bad. As an educator, I want O&M instructors, new O&M instructors, to understand partly the history of assistive technology. Since the 1940s, 50s, there have been dozens and dozens of assistive technology devices developed, and most we don't even remember anymore because they come and they go and no one ever uses them. Some lasted for a while and are no longer. Some have lasted the test of time and they're used by a few people. And just as Nicholas was talking about, we need to be exposed to an array of these devices so we can understand why some of them did not have staying power. What was the problem with them? Maybe they were good enough devices, but they just didn't have a marketable value. And maybe they were flawed from the beginning. But it's also interesting for O&M students to see the development of technology, from early ultrasonic, infrared, clunky devices to there's a phase which maybe we're not out of yet, where people wanted to attach things to the cane, ultrasonic sensors or beams or what have you. And then there's an array of head-mounted devices. And now we've got GPS and we've got iPhones and iPads, and there's just so much out there. O&M students can't be expected to know all of it, but they should be exposed to the different categories of devices and know how to use and train people on using the most popular ones. So that's how I go about choosing devices.
That's great. And go ahead, Sarah Elizabeth. I see you.
Yeah, this is Sarah Elizabeth Bagoon, and I wanted to chime in as well. I often actually teach the class at Rob's program. And when Nicholas was talking about the importance of it having quality to you as a user, one of the things that happens every semester that I teach it is the students look at me at the end of the semester and say, so we've been watching you walk around campus. I'm a blind person. And we don't see you using this device that you taught us in week 1. What do you use that device for? And the answer is, I don't. It doesn't meet a travel need for me. But that's not a reason to not teach another O&M professional that it exists, because I am not, as a totally blind person, every blind traveler. There are people with a lot more vision than I have that will use very different tools to support their low vision travel than I will use as a totally blind traveler. And so I think that spectrum is really important, and that when we're choosing for a university program, it is not important that we represent every brand that exists or we represent every device that exists. But I think it's important we recognize every category of what devices can currently do, so that students have a sampling of the range of supports and the range of types of information that travel aids can give somebody, the range of types of information that orientation aids can give somebody, so that in the future, when they're working with clients who present with a different need, they recognize, oh, there might be a tech out there for it. I could go do a purposeful search for which technologies claim they can meet this identified need, and then have some skills that we'll talk about maybe in the other questions about how to determine whether that's a quality device and whether it is the best device for this specific user.
That's great. And Sarah Elizabeth, one other thing I remember when you and I were talking before is that you mentioned how important that these tools are generalizable. Can you talk a little bit more about that too?
Yeah, I think when we're teaching it in the university setting, there is a necessary component of you have to know what technology is out there, what's the spectrum, what's the depth. But most technologies will get replaced by the next new thing that can do what they do and can do it better and can do it lighter and can do it with longer battery life. So knowing the specific operation pattern of a given device is a little piece of the puzzle, but most of what our students need to learn is the other components. They need to learn how to determine if a device is good quality and how to assess it and weigh it against other devices. They need to know how to have the clinical reasoning skills to determine, is this device going to meet this client's need, right? Maybe this device can tell you how far away an object is, but its output is haptic, and this person doesn't really respond very well to vibration. They would do better with an audio output. So even though it gives the right information, if it's not giving it in the format your client would use, then it's not necessarily the best device for that client. They need to have the pedagogical skills. How do we teach assistive technology? What is the first activity to do with this? What are the sequential baby steps to go from I can turn the device on to I can get useful information out of the device to I can configure the device and tweak it to do all sorts of bells and whistles, additional things. And knowing then also how to incorporate those devices in real boots on the ground, out in the streets lessons, because to use a device in isolation is very different than to use a device when you're actually traveling in a real environment. And those skills, how do I teach it? How do I sequence my lessons? How do I incorporate lessons differently when it's first introduction versus when the client is going to use it for actual travel? Those skills in the professional will apply to every technology they try to introduce, and they will apply to teaching technologies that don't exist while they're in school learning about them, but will exist 5 years into their professional career.
That's great. Thank you so much. And that kind of leads us into the next question I have, which is, what would you describe as the core pillars for instruction in O&M training? And you can start us off, or I can pass it over to Rob to start us off this time.
I think we make Rob start.
Okay.
The core pillars of O&M instruction training. I'll take my caveat from Nick and say I did not prepare answers. And so core pillars of O&M instruction. I want to couch this in terms of the technology piece. Just as we've been talking about introducing students to an array of the categories of different kinds of technology. Two of the core pillars in that area would be orientation-based and mobility-based technology. Technology that gives a person information about their place in the world or in the environment versus obstacle detection kinds of technology. So that's sort of one pillar, is the kinds of technology. The other one is, as Sarah Elizabeth was talking about, knowing not just the technology itself, but how to introduce that technology and go through a series of lessons to teach a person to use it effectively. That would be the second pillar. So knowing the range of technology is one, knowing how to teach it to someone and modify that instructional sequence for a person with different amount of vision, with different learning styles, a person with perhaps neuropathy in their hands, so they don't use tactile information very well, just adapting things for the individual learner.
That's great. Thank you. And go ahead, Sarah Elizabeth. So you unmuted again.
Yeah, I was just going to tag on a thing that is broader than technology, but I think another core pillar of high quality O&M instruction for the professional who's going to become an O&M specialist is to really instill in them a belief that the skills of blindness can work. And it comes up a lot in technology because often when we're doing that sort of light introduction of here are all of the different kinds of orientation and mobility assistive technologies there are, students get this little taste of it and they don't get to proficiency because they're just getting a sample of how that technology works. And so we have to help our students kind of suspend disbelief that while they had a little taste of it and they saw a little of what it can do, we also need them to know and really value that having the tool and using it well could give somebody more independence and could give somebody better travel function and could fill a need for someone that would open up opportunities in their life. And that can be really a growth opportunity for somebody, especially if they've been sighted their whole life, to understand that with the right tools and with the right strategies, the individuals who are blind will also be able to do all the things they want to do. And to recognize that even though your use of the technology was limited and maybe it was overcast that day and the GPS was acting up, that your limited experience having a glitch or two doesn't mean that it's not still a tool that's going to make somebody's life a whole lot easier and a whole lot more smooth.
And do you also focus on high tech and low tech technologies in your training? So something like a compass as well, versus instead of just the higher tech GPS type?
Yeah, I'll say that we do focus on both of them. And in the program, we use them a little bit differently. Some of the low-tech devices like compasses are not being commonly used by blind travelers anymore for the most part, but still have a place in teaching orientation and mobility skills in terms of developing that awareness of heading directions and how when you turn that changes where you're facing. And some tools like that rudimentary compass, like a real physical tactile compass, not just the compass app on your smartphone, play an important role in developing foundational concepts for kids. And other technologies like the high-tech ones are often ones that people will use throughout their lifespan. And it might be that in, again, that age band, that high-tech tools are not something you would use a whole lot with a 3-year-old, but are critical for a 16-year-old or a 36-year-old learning to get around their city. So the different high tech and low tech both need to be taught. And sometimes that comes with a different focus on how they will be used, whether they will be a long-term tool or a short-term tool. And there are other low tech devices like a monocular to spot street signs that are a long-term tool and someone with low vision will use for their entire lifespan to be more efficient in their travel. So it's not that low tech is less useful, but sometimes is used for a specific moment and sometimes is a lifelong tool.
And I'd like to jump in and add on to that, if I might. There are, I would say, a lot of situations where a low-tech mobility tool, perhaps not even considered technology per se, is appropriate for an individual. If you think about it, like a person who follows a guide rope on a path to help maintain their orientation on that path, they're using a mobility tool. It is low tech, but it's appropriate for given situations or given individuals. I wanted to point out that, that we're getting beyond pillars into sort of details, but in addition to what Sarah Elizabeth said, novice O&M instructors also need to recognize that a tool, high or low tech, is not going to provide a person with all the answers. It's a tool. In the same way that we often have to teach the general public that a person with a dog guide isn't just being led around by the dog and the dog is taking them to the store. They are directing the dog on what to do. You know, the person is still in charge of the operation. And that's true for the technology use as well.
Very helpful. Thanks for adding. Nick, did you have anything you wanted to add to this question?
No, my fellow panelists are the experts here. I'm not an O&M instructor or a TVI. I guess the only thing I would add is, you know, as a designer and someone that works a lot in thinking about how to make technology work better and inclusively. So not just, you know, Sarah Elizabeth mentioned working for lots of different people. I think that's important. But I think what is missing a lot of times is crosstalk, interdisciplinary crosstalk. The O&M folks aren't talking with developers and designers and vice versa. And I think what really makes for the best design, and I'm not going out on a limb here, but it just so often doesn't happen, is to get, you know, to have the people that are developing stuff to talk with the boots on the ground people that are doing training and that understand O&M and understand the spatial challenges that may, or the spatial behaviors, or they're just, you know, understand what is being, you know, what the technology is actually helping with, because that will lead to better technology, and vice versa. If the O&M people can also talk with the technology people to figure out what's out there, and sometimes there's really great solutions, but the connections between the people aren't talking to each other, so they're not happening. And so I guess that would be is if instruction could build in these types of interdisciplinary crosstalk opportunities, kind of like what's happening here. You know, I think that's really important. And I would encourage people to check out the forthcoming Foundations book that Rob is co-editing, because that talks about it. There's a lot of really great chapters in there on that. So I'm making a plug, Rob. You don't even have to do it.
That's great. Thank you so much. And actually, that leads us into the next question. I think I had worded it specifically as what elements should be considered when planning for an O&M courses from a universal design for learning lens. But I think what you just hit on there also is how should we be thinking about planning technology from a universal design for learning lens?
Yeah, I don't know if so. I mean, I would agree, and I think that the coming from both sides is important. And I think often the technology side doesn't do that. You know, as we've all reviewed papers from often well-meaning people that are developing technology, but often very uninformed, and it leads to the 60+ years of stuff that's out there that Rob mentioned and Sarah Elizabeth mentioned that, you know, often doesn't get used, and a lot of it's not because it's bad, but because it's not really being driven by the right questions, by user input, and by that crosstalk that I think is so important.
Yeah, when considering universal design, I've seen enough projects driven by engineers that essentially are done to prove that they can do X. It doesn't really accomplish anything in terms of assisting a person who's blind in orientation or mobility. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it or should do it that way. But more generally, when looking at higher education, instructional design, and from a universal design lens, more universities are putting courses online. to greater or lesser effectiveness. Our department started doing that in the 90s by sending out DVDs to students that they would watch at home. And then over the years, the university has rolled out various online software systems for structuring our classes to greater or lesser accessibility levels. And so it is important that the agency or university that rolls out these kinds of platforms does thorough accessibility testing ahead of time with people who would use that technology in certain ways, not with an engineer who says, yeah, it'll work great. Someone like an end user who would use it, a sample student who goes through and runs a class or takes a class in a mock way, so we can get a robust feel for what the accessibility pitfalls are. And then every time it gets updated, do it again. Because every time software gets updated, generally there become inaccessible holes in that software. Happens with everything.
And I think that's a good point when we're talking about how would you universally design sort of a remote university class that teaches personnel preparation students how to use assistive technology. Because, if you're video streaming with students, you miss the blind students if you just hold up a piece of tech and visually demo it, potentially. So you have to plan for how is everyone going to be able to hear what the tech outputs are clearly over the remote space. I want to kind of flip the script on that, though. We also have to plan very specifically for the needs of our sighted students sometimes, because a lot of the hands-on portion of technology teaching happens under blindfold and in a lot of our programs. And that means that we've got students who are just beginning to learn cane skills under blindfold, also in that same semester then being asked to learn how to use a GPS dedicated device under blindfold. And it's really important to kind of embed in that the technology is introduced several steps behind where the cane skills are, and recognize that our sighted students who are just brand new with their cane skills are going to experience more fully what typical students do. That is, when they're traveling and they start using their tech, their cane skills will fall apart because they're distracted by the new technology and thinking about what the process is and trying to understand what it's saying or vibrating or what the output is. And that can distract them from their good cane skills. So the amount of safety supervision we provide our students needs to be more in that moment so that we can ensure that they're safe. And at least in our university classes, we sometimes see that the blind graduate students who have been using their own travel skills for decades at that point don't experience that setback with the new technology in quite the same way, because their cane skills are so automatic. And so we have to be really direct about, be aware that your students, when you're teaching them and they are new cane users and new tech users, or they are new guide dog users and new tech users, are going to experience a regression in their own safety skills that you need to step up the monitoring for in that moment.
I'd like to add another part of that. Sarah Elizabeth's comments reminded me that universal design for instruction or for technology, we generally, when we speak of that, we are thinking of the development of the technology or of the software or of the portal. It is also education of the instructor or the person who's going to lead the use of that technology or that portal. They need to think about how they're going to be using it, what kind of information they're going to be communicating, how they're going to communicate that information, so that they are thinking, like Sarah Elizabeth was saying, about the universal design of their content, so that all students are going to be able to get the content in a effective manner.
That's great. Thank you. And that kind of leads actually into the next question, which is, what are some of the challenges to teaching O&M virtually? And I think you mentioned quite a few of them already, Sarah Elizabeth, but I wasn't sure if there were any other ones, maybe related to Braille instruction, or something, or things to that nature that might be impacted.
I'll start off the answers just by saying that the biggest issue is teaching sighted students keen skills. That is very hard to do remotely. I would say I'll go out on a limb and say impossible to do well remotely. We are making some inroads in how to monitor interns who are working with students and doing that remotely, but teaching the skills and concepts themselves to a new O&M instructor or a O&M student, that really is best done in person. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think on the technology side, at the end of the day, there needs to be an in-person moment for something. And so designing a curriculum, you really want to approach the task kind of flexibly and say, what are all the pieces of the teaching and all the pieces of the learning that we want for the long term? And which of those things are just lecture? And lecture can be done remotely. We know how to do lectures well remotely. Which of those are discussion? We can even do discussions remotely. But setting up actual demonstrations in the remote space is really tricky. If you think about something that's even just basic obstacle detection, is there an obstacle or is there not? You can model that on a video. And then can you catch the sound output from it clearly so the students can hear it? And even if you can, they're not in the real physical space with you to link the feedback the device is giving them and the actual experience of how far away is the obstacle, how large is the obstacle that it's being able to detect. So you can prep a lot of the student readiness to take those experiences in a remote way. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of things that won't coalesce in your understanding until you have the hands-on experience in the real space. With orientation aids, get into kind of the same thing, that you can look at GPS remotely. It takes a lot of setup to do it well if you're going to design it for everybody so that they can see the screen and hear the voice output and perceive that the device is vibrating when they're seeing a model of it done either in real time or done as like a pre-recorded something. And so it's more complicated than just, say, teaching a class on history is in a virtual space, because you are trying to capture so many outputs of a device while also capturing the instructor and the instruction. And I think that kind of adds a level of complexity, but not a level of complexity that means don't try it. One that means be intentional about what it is you're trying to get the students to learn in that distance education space. And I think for technology, it's often priming them to be ready to get the most out of the hands-on experience. And then you can encapsulate the hands-on experience in an in-person way and kind of cut down your in-person time or your intensity so that we think of it in our class as doing the lab, right? We come together and we do the lab with the real technology and have the real experience and process and debrief on the real experience, but have put whatever we can to get ready for that into the virtual space.
That's great. Thanks. Nick, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I really don't have much to add. Those all sound like great tips.
Good. Well, I'm going to put you on the spot for this last question that I have, because knowing about some of your work, I just wanted to get everyone's thoughts on what is intriguing or enticing about potential opportunities in the future of this field, but in general, in terms of accessible technologies.
I mean, in my head, the thing that I'm excited about two things really. And one of them is that accessible technologies, I think, are increasingly not being designed. We need to take the user in mind. We need to think about the user, as we've talked about. But I think part of the problem with tech in general is that we have mainstream technology and we have this niche of accessible technology, which is often, some one unimodal way of providing information non-visually usually. And I think what's beginning to happen is that our technology is beginning to be more multisensory in general. We're using more senses, and it makes sense, like it's our brain normally has these multiple senses of information. We perceive the world through different senses. And so it's kind of weird that mainstream technology is mostly, we have visual displays and we have some auditory information, and maybe there's a vibration here or there. But we're starting to see devices, the phone being a great example, but others that are utilizing multiple modes of information input and output in the native interface. So it's not an access technology, it's a platform that uses multiple sensors and multiple sensory inputs and outputs that really then supports access. And I think that's the way of the future, because it means that things are being developed in the mainstream, which means they'll get done. Yeah, there'll be problems because a lot of times, you come across an icon that's, user interface that works fine, and then someone doesn't label a button. Obviously, there's things to think about, but the more that we can incorporate multiple sources of information, the more people we're going to support. The other thing that I'm excited about, and some people aren't, but my personal, I'm very interested in head reference technology. So as computer vision and machine learning algorithms and smart devices and all these things get better, and we miniaturize stuff so it doesn't look awkward. I mean, no one wants to wear something, even if it works well. Certainly I don't, that, makes you look kind of like a cyborg. But if you can have, the smaller, very small cameras that can be used for head referenced information in real time, I think there's going to be tons and tons of applications for this. And it's not quite there yet, but it's getting very close. And I think that's what I'm excited about.
Great. Thanks, Nick.
And I'm interested in virtual reality and the possible applications. I mean, people often think of virtual reality as a visually based medium, which is by and large true. But like Nick was saying, with increased computing power, increased miniaturization, I'm wondering whether it might not be too long before we can get really robust 3D sound happening in virtual reality, and potentially pairing that with a system where you can move around in the world, like in the virtual world, so that a person who is blind or sighted could use the same gear to move around in a virtual environment. That opens up a lot of possibilities for a lot of different things. There was a guy, I think at the University of Portland, like 20 years ago or so, who was working on a sort of virtual reality system where the person using the system would be on a set of essentially treadmills. So they could walk, or he had people in wheelchairs wheel through the virtual world that they were in. And so, if you have that sort of input, that kinesthetic input allowed while you're seeing the virtual world, I don't think it can be done right now, but I don't know how far off we are.
I don't remember the name of it. It might be Sweden's army that is using one of those treadmill beasts for training, and it's a big circular disc, and all the treadmills walk back into the center so you can walk in every direction. And the people who use that one talk about how short the adjustment period is, which always makes me a little nervous that it's going to be the sort of thing that the actual sensation is just a little bit off of the real sensation of moving in the world in ways that are not all that significant if you're a sighted person, but might be really significant if you're a blind person who really takes that information that's coming in through your feet into account in how you move in the world. As far as emerging technology goes, for me, I want a self-driving car. America is a very automobile dependent infrastructure. This country is not set up to be walkable, and a self-driving car would be amazing for O&M, but also I want that miniaturized to be a robotic guide dog, because I think that would be just the coolest thing ever.
Hey, the Japanese have devised all sorts of robotic guide dogs.
They have all kinds of, and I'm not allergic to any of their dogs, so we're gonna have to get me one of those.
Well, Sarah Elizabeth, you just wait a few years. We're working on autonomous vehicle stuff.
Perfect. I want one.
Me too.
And I want the legislation to catch up with that, because having an autonomous vehicle that's designed and approved for the road is only as good for blind people as the legislation that goes with that. If the legislation says you need to have a driver's license to operate an autonomous vehicle so that 10-year-olds aren't going places, I'm going to get left behind again for exactly the technology that would be a great equalizer for me.
You're in the right state, though.
I am in the right state. So, that's a consideration too, that a technology that could be a breakthrough for blind people is only a breakthrough if they have access to it. And that's true in its interface, but it's also true in its cost point and in the policies that regulate it. And that there's a number of kind of levels and iterations of access that all need to come together in the right place for us to be able to utilize the technology.
And I think that's a key take home for anyone here. Like this, what Sarah Elizabeth just said, is just that interdisciplinary crosstalk. Like you can solve one problem, but this is a multidimensional, challenge. And, it has to be looked at throughout the whole cycle.
That's great. Yeah, actually, as you guys were just talking, I hadn't thought about the legislation as much, and that's a really critical point. But also just the fact that I knew about the price point. I've heard so many pieces of that, especially some of the refreshable braille displays. I know 3D printers have gotten more reasonable, but the tactographic displays that people are working on, the price point's been an issue. Breaking easily has been an issue, but then talking about using stuff like that in schools, in K-12 schools, is student privacy and interoperability. And there's like so many levels to things that on the surface seem like they should be relatively simple. And so just, Nick, one more question about the interdisciplinary crosstalk. When you think about the different people that should be brought together in a room to have a discussion or hash out some of these issues, who would you include? Like, who do you think has to be at the table, I guess is what I'm wondering.
I think it's somewhat situational, and I'm not trying to be wiggly here, but like if you're talking about a navigation technology for, something that would work in a normal O&M context, having people that are training, so people like this panel that understand both the needs and the challenges and how strategies, connecting with technology developers, the engineers, but also the researchers, because I think theory informs practice and practice informs theory, and a lot of times those things don't happen. And it doesn't take having a focus group or a group session and kind of cataloging these things can make a huge difference. Once you start getting into the space of autonomous vehicles, as was mentioned, then you start getting into legislative and policy level stuff that it's true with things like accessible voting. I was involved with something here in Maine that I was really happy that we ultimately got accessible absentee ballots. But it took multiple people being involved, and so it depends a little bit on the task, but really thinking about what the whole kind of ecosystem is, what the what the space is that you're looking at and saying who are the people that are involved, and then getting them together, making sure that the people that are making decisions or having needs or are doing the design are all together. I think that's what's really important. And if you leave one group out, one part of that system out, then it can break. And so it's really important to think about it as a whole.
And if the various disability populations were represented at the tables where the decisions were being made in the first place, it wouldn't be necessary.
Yeah, we talk a lot about retrofitting, especially being working with the AIM Center, Accessible Educational Materials Center at CAST, and what happens, continues to happen with procurement, with selection of materials, with development of materials, is they don't bring the right people to the table until later. And then it's too late because it's already created or it's already been purchased. And we end up with materials for kids that are not accessible.
Right. So when you reverse that and say who needs to be at the table, it's situational in the sense that everyone who would have been at the table for that decision to be made, if it were for the non-disabled population, still needs to be invited to the table along with the AT folks or the O&M folks who are involved in this problem specific for blindness. But if we reverse that, and when the first set of developments had been made, if people who are blind and people who are deaf and people with autism had all been at the table, we might have had a universally designed space that didn't need the retrofit.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And if you look at it in a larger context, this applies as well to our entire built environment. Sidewalks, roads, intersections, parks, they're designed by city planners, traffic engineers, and it's not until the last 10, 20 years that the users, people who are blind, O&M instructors, those folks have been going and being at the table where those decisions are made, so that rather than reacting to the environment, we can have a say in how the environment should be built so that it's accessible from the beginning instead of trying to figure out how to get around issues.
And I think all the moms who have ever pushed a stroller are very grateful that somebody finally listened to the folks who use wheelchairs and put those curb cuts in, right? Because when it's well designed for the needs of more people, more people's needs are met. And I think we're sometimes surprised at how the design changes that are driven by disability become design changes that everyone appreciates and everyone receives a better product then.
That is so true. I mean, you think about captions on TV, people who use them at the gym all the time, audio description for movies. I have lots of friends who can go around and clean their house now and listen to a movie instead of having to watch it. So it benefits such a broad population when it's considered from the beginning. So this has been great. Do you guys have any other thoughts you'd like to share with us before we go? Okay, well then, thank you so much for joining us today. This was absolutely fantastic and so much great information shared. And I hope we'll get to keep in touch in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.